using your browser or something similar. And also on Linux side, you will find that most of web server directory is not writable by default. So you'll be able to find, if you can be able to find one, then you'll be able to exploit it. So traditionally, you can see that simple PHP script can be used to execute command. So if we can just use a PHP system function to execute our command, so why we need a more reliable shell, which I mean is like a powerful shell? The good answer for this is the Metaprater and the VNC shell. So you can see here, Metaprater shell is very useful in the post-exploitation process. So basically, you can use Metaprater shells to conduct token impersonation attacks on Windows to escalate privilege of a local system to become an administrator user. And also, you can migrate from one process to another process using the shells. And a few other things you can do here. You can do a keyboard loggings, and you also can retrieve your MySQL password and stuff. And Metaprater in Unix is still under development because what I found out is like to write a Metaprater on Unix is a bit like tedious. It's because of the random stack parameterization that you have on most of the Unix. So basically, it's still under development, and hopefully, it will release in one day. And then the VNC shells is the conditions where if you, let's say, you want to have a GUI access on the Windows machines, and you want to use your Windows machine to compromise another system. So to upload your tools or installs or some of your tool will be harder because you will find that most of the Windows application run as a GUIs anyway. So you can simply use these VNC shells to do your work. And then a fingerprinting MySQL, okay? So for remote executions on the MySQL PHP, the fingerprinting of the version is not required. This is different when you when you try to attack MySQL with the stack query enable, because you need to know where your shared libraries should be located. So this version may be in this directory, or another version should be in this directory. But however, when you want to attack some MySQL PHP, you need to know the amounts of columns that required on your second query, because basically you are only tied to use the union select. So in union select, your second query should be the same as the first query. But the cool things about MySQL, it doesn't care about data type. So it doesn't care about what data type you have on all your columns on the first query, because if you use a different data type on the second query, you'll still be able to fingerprint it. And then I can say the best method to fingerprint through union select here is if you combine it with a time-based injection method. So time-based injection method is basically known as a timing attack. So it's basically, it depends on the response of the application. Because the reason of this is because sometimes when you use a blind or Boolean injection method, it will not yield any result. So here are some techniques in reading and writing file on the MySQL. So basically, we use select load file to read a file and select into out file or dump file to write a file. So here's a brief explanation about select load in files. It requires it to have a file privilege, and also your file must be writable by world writables, and the size it should be less than this value. And default value is small, but it's sufficient enough for you to fingerprint important stuff. Like examples, if you want to know web server directory, you basically need to load your default configuration of Apache files, and because this file contains the information about your web server directory. And then select into dump file also requires you to have a file privilege, and you can use this method with the unions and then to dump into one file. So you're only allowed to use one time to write the whole arbitrary file, because this file cannot be overwritten. So you have only one chance to upload the whole arbitrary file into one place. And also you will find that this file that you create will be writable. This is because the MySQL server try to prevent you to backdoor, like example, your MySQL configuration file. So when it looks like, oh, this file is writable, they will not read it. And the cool thing about select into dump file, you can directly write an executable file. So which means you don't have to think about any conversion trick that you have to do, like example, for some databases, like example on MySQL, where you have to convert a text to the binary, because basically select into dump file, you will just directly write into the binary. And also, there's another one issue in Linux is a file is created is not executable by default. So if you upload your shellcode, it's not executable. And I'm going to explain in the future, in these talks, that how we can make it executable. So here is some brief explanation how we can conduct a remote code executions on the MySQL PHP. So basically, we will upload our compressed arbitrary file into the web server using a union select. And then we can use a PHP script to decompress back this arbitrary file to back into the original size. And then we can use a PHP script system function to execute this file. And here is the methods how you can fingerprint the web server directory. Like I mentioned before, you can just basically use the load in file methods to read default configuration of Apache files. And another method is known as error message generation. So basically what it does is by injecting some bogus data as part as your SQL query, you'll be able to, in some cases, you'll be able to force the PHP to return you an error message. And in most cases, you will find this error message contain information about your web server directory. So as we know that the only technique we can use to write our arbitrary data through the union selects. And here are some challenges in writing the arbitrary data through the union select. So the main biggest problem is the GET request, because GET request only limited you to up to 8,190 bytes. And most of the time you find your arbitrary data will be bigger than this size. And also the second way is the data from your first query can overwrite your file header. So which means when you have a union select and your data from the first query will be the data that will be written first, and this will overwrite your file header and it will corrupt your file. And then the next one is you will find that your data from the extra columns can add necessary data into your arbitrary file, and this also can potentially corrupt your code. So I'm going to explain in details how we can fix all this problem. Okay, so hang on. I'm sorry. Okay, fixing the URL length issue. So basically, we can just simply use this PHP zlib module to compress our arbitrary file. In my experience, from 9,625 bytes, I was able to compress my file only up to 630 bytes. And this was pretty small and can be able to bypass the maximum limit allowed in Apache, and also can bypass most of the web application firewalls. And this file can be decompressed back to the original files before it's been executed. So, and if you look at here, right, the union select will combine the result from the first query with the second query. And you will find that the result from the first query can overwrite your file header. So to prevent this from happening, what can you do is you can inject a non-existing data in the while clause to force the application to return empty data for the first query. Like example here, you can see the first query written as a string called defcon, and that will overwrite our file header. So if we can change our question equal to 169 into question equal to any non-existing value, you will force the